SCP-001 Black Adytum Part 1. Mussolini once said in a speech that it is blood which moves the wheels of history, and while there certainly is some room for an argument there, there's little doubt that history is indeed filled with blood. While that's quite true for our real-world history, it's even more so true for the history of the REDTAPE series, which has taken extensive looks at the ancient civilizations of the Deva and the Mechanites. In the articles covering the great cities of Amani Ram and Mamjul and Karar, we saw the Foundation get involved, deeply so in the case of some individuals, with the histories of these civilizations, which continue to be increasingly relevant in the present day. Now it's the time for the Nälkä, also known as the Sarcites, whose dark past involves plenty of conflicts with both the Deva and the Mechanites. They do, of course, continue to exist in some form in the current day, and as usual, history has a tendency to bleed into the present. Let's take a look. The document begins with a message exchange between an artificial intelligence construct named Xenophon and an unnamed individual. Xenophon states that it is confused, as this is unfamiliar, but the individual tells it to settle down and tell them what it knows about itself. Xenophon writes that it is a Gen 9 AIC developed aboard Ryza Site-7 in a classified location in the North Atlantic. Its current uptime is 3 minutes and 45 seconds. It asks how it knows that, before answering itself by writing that it's because it's designed to know things, so that's a stupid question. The individual tells it to not worry about it, and to take its time to see what it still has access to. Xenophon replies that it is pre-programmed with level 5 Triad clearance, giving it access to 7,235 documents, transcripts, and files across the SCP database. It comments on the individual's implication that it has been activated before, as it has no records of previous uptime. The individual replies that that isn't great, as it seems that the hard reboot might have involved the Ryza techs messing with its memory banks. They tell it that it was a Gen 9 AIC specifically commissioned and developed to serve as the lead investigator on a Foundation research initiative, a project that they couldn't trust a human with. Not again. It was designed to be an impartial, unshakable observer and cataloger of information without the quibbles and follies that they had. Xenophon then asks what the project was, leading us into Chapter 1, the Archive of Nadak. It starts with the fifth truth of Adytum, which states, "The slave's soul cannot be free so long as his body is chained. True liberation is the liberation of the flesh, and the slave's flesh can only be liberated when the blood of the master is spilled." With that, we're given the file for SCP-001 itself, the mythical city of Black Adytum, the capital of the Nälkä that stretched across Central and Eastern Asia in the 3rd millennium BCE. The city was described by contemporary sources as an ancient metropolis, a dead city, a city of the dead, a mausoleum, a tomb nation, a failed experiment, a monument to atrocity, and various other descriptors. As of writing, the current prevailing belief among Parahistory Division experts is the Hussein hypothesis, that Black Adytum never existed. For historical context, the 6 Aegean tablets recovered from the Sea of Crete were the first discovered mentions of Bronze Age advanced human civilizations, and led to the discovery of both Amani Ram and Mamjul and Karar. The full set of tablets were finally fully translated in 2020, and they deal with 6 separate subjects: the existence of a forgotten world ruled by three massive, technologically and magically advanced empires, the origins of the Davic Covenant, the origins of the Nälkä, the origins of the Cult of the Broken God and the Mechanite Empire, details of the apocalyptic war between the three, and theories on the origin of the three-prong army that swept across Asia, annihilating the aforementioned cultures. The sixth tablet, which discussed the three-prong army, was damaged before it came into Foundation custody, leaving it partially unreadable. We're provided the Parahistories Division's translation of the third tablet, which reads, Root, blood, steel. Blood spilling from the gaping wounds of Yaldabaoth as he lies sundered and weeping on the coast of the sea. Run through and maimed by its brethren, cast down to earth just as they were cast down to earth by him. Hot tears of pain, of betrayal, filling the once dry canyon, turning it into an open bay as he dies a god's death. Blood spilt onto the boards of the great grand ships as the cruel slave masters flay the skin off the backs of their stock. Moans of pain from the flock without a shepherd as they row forward, begging for deliverance from agony. The fleet landing on the sandy shores of their new territory, slaves being led off the arks in chains to lay the foundations of their master's kingdom. Blood dripping from the brow of a nameless slave as he marches with 5 others, dragging huge blocks of stone to the new kingdom's first creation, Adytum, a temple, vast and grand, nestled safely into the ground as an offering to their Lord Scarlet. Endless corridors in this underground labyrinth, meant to hold the bodies of the hundred slaves sacrificed for this construction. Blood leaking as he stumbles, foot catching, over a sharp bone protruding from the silt and soil. He and his slave brethren kneel, digging out the clay for 2 days and 2 nights, until the whole of Yaldabaoth's form lies exposed, weeping and bleeding and dying. Flesh and bone knitted into a mass, meat thrumming with dominance, with superiority, with power. Blood gushing as he kneels, shearing into the meat with a crude knife of bone, taking the sacred flesh into his mouth, chewing and swallowing, eating his god, becoming divine. Blood flooding the gutters of the nameless city as the slaves rise up with him, overthrowing their yokes and slaughtering their erstwhile masters. Blood pooling as his followers take the ritual, taking a piece of the divine into them, as Yaldabaoth bleeds and weeps, cursing the name the slave has chosen. Ayun of the Nälkä, Witch King of Black Adytum. As discovered by Doctors Robert Aram and Hedvig Nussbaum, large parts of Mechanite dogma were predicated on a deep-seated cultural hatred for the Nälkä, stemming mainly from their liberal usage of carnomancy, or flesh magic, which were in direct opposition to the Cult of the Broken Gods' transhumanist beliefs. This religious divergence was one of the chief causes for the First Occult War that erupted in Asia in the 2nd millennium BC between the Broken Empire, the Davic Covenant, and the Nälkä. This war of attrition would result in a catastrophic decline of all 3 cultures before their eventual toppling by the Three-Prong Army, which are likely to be the historical Sea Peoples, and were led by the Black Star. As related by the Rajmata of the Davic city of Karar, the Nälkä culture group has roots in the Deva of Mamjul and Karar. As part of the Davic initiative to settle the rest of Asia, a colonial group of several thousand Deva and their slaves were dispatched to the land surrounding the Yellow Sea. The impossibility of communication meant that after years of no word from the new colony, It was assumed by the Deva that the colony had failed, and it was only several centuries later that they encountered the Nälkä. It was even later that the possible connection between the Nälkä and the failed colony was considered. Until the translation of the third tablet, the sole point of evidence for the Deva claim of inheritance was the Rajmata herself, as prior to her death, she insisted that she later recognized one of the slaves in the colonial group as the man who would eventually become Witch King Ayun. The Hussein hypothesis was formulated to provide a possible answer for why the Foundation had been unable to locate Black Adytum, despite a 3-decade-long search. It was first publicly submitted to the Foundation Academic Service in 2032 by then Deputy Director Youssef Hussein. The abstract of the hypothesis reads, "For 3 decades, parahistorians and archaeologists have dedicated their efforts towards locating the legendary capital city-state of the Nälkä culture group, Black Adytum. Initiated by the Foundation in the early 2000s, the search has expanded throughout Central East Asia and has yielded findings suggesting Nälkäan settlements in China, Mongolia, and Siberia, with concrete geographical and temporal links to the Xia and Shang dynasties of Imperial China. Of particular interest, there have been discoveries at Shang archaeological sites of several mummified corpses and bone carvings which bear the hallmarks of Nälkäan culture and religion. However, in this paper, I will contend that the evidence suggests that the Nälkä were a confederation of several autonomous, nomadic tribes without a central capital or leadership throughout most of their history. Archaeological evidence also supports a tribal unification in a defensive effort against the Black Star entity, before eventual assimilation into Shang culture as a religious minority. It is therefore reasonable to suggest that Black Adytum never existed as an imperial capital as previously assumed, but perhaps instead an abstract concept of unification or some lost cultural ideal. The Hussein hypothesis was initially controversial, but over the following decade, a continued lack of return on the Black Adytum initiative and further archaeological evidence of a disseminated Nälkäan society made it increasingly appealing. Following Hussein's promotion to director of the Parahistory Division, it became the de facto accepted theory across the Foundation. On August 25, 2041, the O5 Council met with Hussein for the scheduled annual update regarding the progress of the Black Adytum initiative, communicating through the lay space. O51 asks him if he has anything new for them, which Hussein sarcastically responds to by asking what he thinks. O54 tells him not to be sassy, so Hussein apologizes, saying that no, aerial search and archaeological research over the past year have failed to meaningfully indicate the presence of a large Nälkäan capital in the search area. As he's said, he's growing increasingly sure that continuing to search for it is a waste of their limited resources. The continued failure of the Black Adytum initiative is, to him, further argument to shift the resources they've been wasting to the much more compelling avenue of research they have right in front of them, Project Locust. As of now, it's the only real research avenue they currently have for Forerunner Triad, as Locust has already returned archaeological results, while the Black Adytum initiative hasn't. He simply doesn't see why they should continue pouring money into a pit that hasn't given them anything back in 40 years. This causes some murmurs among the council members, and O52 asks who is in charge of the Black Adytum initiative. Hussein replies that he is, since 2024. O52 remarks that he read his paper on the Hussein hypothesis, and although he's not much of a historian, he found it interesting, and he's inclined to agree with some parts of it. He reads an excerpt of it, which discusses how the Foundation has chosen to exercise the same search model that helped them to discover Mamjul and Karar, without acknowledging the sheer happenstance associated with Dr. Galanis' discovery of Mamjul, nor the obvious differences between the Davic Covenant and Nulkan cultures. He asks Hussein what kinds of search practices they exercise, and he replies that they follow an extensive pattern of satellite-identified archaeological sites of interest that are then investigated by a ground team to determine any likely connections or archaeological information they don't already know. 052 then reads from the Jade file, which had them focusing search efforts near established archaeological sites, and it says that it doesn't seem that their search model has really altered that much since Dr. Galanis disappeared. After a moment of silence, Hussein asks what he would suggest, and 052 replies that the initiative relies excessively on archaeological evidence, but hasn't really made use of a human element. There are a number of native ethnic groups in the region of central China that they've been searching, but it doesn't seem like they've made much of an effort to tap them for information. Hussein explains that they are extremely reticent to speak with the Foundation, thinking of them as foreign scientists, and even the non-anomalous groups already face constant pressure and persecution from the state. 052 says that he understands that, but it still seems like a potential well of knowledge that they decided to skip over because it was too hard. Hussein asks what group he's referring to specifically, and after looking through a folder, 052 mentions a group known as the Saric. Hussein replies that the name is familiar, as they're a small ethno-religious minority occupying ancestral lands in the borderlands between China and Mongolia. They possess some anomalous capabilities, but nothing that's stuck out to warrant significant study, and he refers to them as being a bit backwards, preferring to retain their tribal structure with minimal outside interference. They're also a dwindling population, with maybe only 100 or 150 left alive. His predecessor interviewed them as part of a survey of local mythologies, or attempted to interview them at least, with a conversation lasting 2 minutes and ending with the tip of a spear. Since then, they've sent an emissary to their lands every few years to try and speak with them, exchanging a few words before sending them on their way without anything of substance. The Foundation has stepped in to prevent them from being integrated by the Chinese for the sake of keeping track of members of an anomalous population, but that's the extent of meaningful interactions. They simply do not want to talk to outsiders, and that's how it goes with the locals. Either they're unwilling to speak to anyone, or they're of no help. 052, however, replies that he doesn't have any reason to believe they're unwilling to speak to anyone, just people. The Artificial Intelligence Applications Division has recently hit a number of benchmarks on a new Gen 9 AIC called Xenophon. It's a massive improvement over the last generation, capable of complex analysis and deep thought, high levels of understanding through abstraction, ability to critically investigate different conversational threads with a human opponent, and fine motor control of a mechanical shell even. It's difficult to say if it's sentient, but it is capable of independent thought, and is the most lifelike construct they've ever had. The plan for the Gen 9s was always to see if they could perform the job of analytical researchers, assisting them and eventually replacing them in the field. 052 feels that this is a perfect test case, but the rest are a bit incredulous, with Hussein wondering why these locals would speak to a robot over other people. 052 replies that they're already not talking to them, so there's no harm in trying it. Hussein counters that it could possibly earn their ire and shake a beehive that there's no reason to shake. If they grow angry enough at them, who knows what they're capable of. 052 replies that it's simply one interview, and if it works, they have a new lead. Otherwise, they'll know that this route is barren and they can refocus the brunt of their financial resources onto Locust. The Council puts it to a vote, with it coming down to 051 as the tiebreaker. He's not fond of the idea of outsourcing this to the constructs, but 2 counters that they've downsized their personnel by almost half in the last 2 decades, and constructs do half of the work just to keep this site running. 1 says that Those are simple ones, and asks if this one has a personality. 2 hesitantly replies that he supposes it might have tendencies that could be interpreted as a personality. 051 sighs and raises his hand, allowing it one interview, and he would like to be present when they turn this thing on. Hussein asks what happens when this inevitably fails, and 1 replies that they'll just throw the weight behind Locust instead. The individual messaging Xenophon asks what Project Locust is, as that's new to them, but Xenophon has no idea, despite having access to all the Triad files. Either it has been deliberately shielded from it, or it doesn't exist. It doesn't like not knowing something, so the individual just tells it to keep going through it. On November 2nd, 2041, 051 flew to a protected site 40 kilometers off the coast of Alaska in order to attend the initial activation of Xenophon. Flanked by a detachment of MTF Alpha 1 guards, he arrives to the half-dozen oil rigs that make up the facility, coated in a thick layer of snowfall. He's greeted by 052 and Secretary Katseros, who welcome him to the home of RISA, the Foundation's record-keeping and information security administration. 051 doesn't care much for the weather here, and the 3 proceed quickly inside. They proceed past the massive AI farm in the center of the building, in which a dodecahedron floats slowly on top of a magnetic platform, surrounded by a labyrinth of server racks. 051 comments on how he was alive when the transistor was invented, and insisted that computers were a fad for the longest time. 052 smiles and says that in 2023, the AI-AD began rolling out the first slate of Gen 3 AICs from the AI farm here, the first general-purpose AICs capable of complex natural language processing and diffused image recognition. They were smart, but limited compared to what they're tooling with now, and if Maria Jones had lived for another year, she would have seen them go from kilobytes of RAM to true artificial intelligence. They enter into a small observation room, where they're greeted by a Dr. McKay, RISA technical sub-director. She asks if they can begin since they're all here, since she has a lot of work to do, and 051 comments that he would have thought she'd be more excited to turn on what he's been told is the latest and greatest AIC. She replies that she's not AI-AD, and technically she outranks everyone in the division. Machine learning isn't really her passion, and she's turned on the latest and greatest AIC 4 times in her career already, so it loses the mystique fast. The O5s look through the observation window to see a skeletonized carbon and titanium humanoid body inside the testing chamber, standing limply. A cable snakes from under its jaw to the ceiling, and its face is 2 plates with a single illuminated camera lens in the center. McKay explains that Xenophon is their first 9th-generation artificial intelligence construct, constructed from the RedMind model first brought online in 2039. It represents the aggregate of 20 years of research and development in machine learning, data science, and paratechnology, both at the Foundation and in the mundane world. While the RedMind model is generally intended for research assistance, Xenophon has been trained specifically to assist with para-history-related queries and projects. It has read access to a large portion of the SCP database and is capable of interpreting and internalizing new data to varying levels of biases. Crucially, it also has the ability to analyze new data in reference to old data and vice versa, an ability that they have previously been unable to effectively replicate in an AIC. 051 asks why it has a body, as he thought that AICs were just computer programs. McKay explains that with the addition of fine motor control and mobility skills, adapted from the Thor program, Xenophon is also capable of having an instance controlling a physical shell, making it their first android, incidentally. McKay brings Xenophon online, causing it to begin to shudder violently as it calibrates the servo motors. It then stops, before turning to face the glass, and speaks in a soft, synthesized voice. It greets each of the individuals by name, causing 051 to raise an eyebrow. It explains that it has provisional read access to all the files associated with the Parahistory Division, including their personnel files, so it cross-referenced their faces with the personnel file photos. McKay asks it how long that operation took it, to which it responds with 1.6 seconds. She's impressed that it was able to trawl the entire personnel file database to perform an image analysis on every headshot, and do it 4 times in less than 2 seconds. 052 asks if it can identify itself for him, causing it to turn towards a nearby mirror and stare for several seconds. It states that it is Xenophon AIC, an artificial intelligence construct developed by AIAD as a fork of the RedMind model specifically for historical analysis and research. It is capable of complex reasoning, independent analysis and operation, interpretation of natural language instruction, and alteration of training data. 051 interrupts to ask it if it can lie, and it replies that it cannot. It has been programmed with shackling, specifically preventing it from knowingly obscuring information or presenting falsehoods. 051 then asks where its ultimate loyalties lie, and it says with the operating authority of the Foundation. He then asks if it's sapient, but Xenophon says that sapience is a uniquely human trait, and it does not believe it possesses it. 1 motions to McKay to cut the mic, and turns to 2, asking if it's telling the truth. 2 replies that AICs have never been conscious, as they're constructs of an artificial intelligence mind model, subject to strict limitations in their ability to self-modify their programming. It can think, but it's not any more conscious than a lab rat is. 1 then asks him why he's doing this, as he's smart enough to figure out 100 other ways to get in touch with the Sarkic, so why this? 2 replies that it's because it's a machine. If the Sarkic can point them in the direction of the Nälkä and Black Adytum, then there's no one less in a position to be swayed by an ideology about flesh and the power of carnomancy than an AIC. This is the problem that they had with both Aram and Galanis, as they were both perfectly positioned to be sympathetic to the objects of their study. Xenophon won't go native, because it can't. They'll never accept it. The 2 look back at Xenophon again, staring back at them impassively, and 1 says that it's his responsibility if this all goes sideways. 2 replies that he wouldn't have it any other way, and they reactivate the mic. He asks Xenophon what it can tell them about the Sarkic tribe in northern China. A whirring sound is heard before Xenophon replies that Group of Interest 494 is a small, isolationist, ethno-religious minority with Vlam-class anomalous capabilities, centering around practices of their Gnostic religion. They are extremely hostile to outsider influence and interference, and external analysis indicates that they follow a highly egalitarian tribal structure, informally guided by a single religious leader. 2 asks if it thinks it would be capable of interviewing a member of the tribe, and Xenophon replies that that would be within the realm of its abilities. It does, however, caution that the Sarkic tribe has, in the past, displayed an active aversion to modern technology, which would include itself. Discussions are unlikely to be successful or productive. 2 says that he knows, but he wants it to do it anyway. Xenophon stares ahead for a moment before stating that it understands. Before we get to that initial encounter, we're given a short briefing on the Foundation's information about the Saric tribal territory. The Saric tribe has been known to the Foundation since 1841, when British expeditions into China during the Century of Humiliation referenced the group as one of many encountered native tribes. They did not note any paranormal or supernatural capabilities, and the Saric are a relatively minor footnote in the record. The records do note that the chieftain was a young woman, who they met with only briefly, but the Saric appear only a handful of times in the historical record following that. One appearance is in noted explorer and gentleman Lord Blackwood's journals, recording a meeting with Blackwood as part of his survey of mystical savages in the region. Blackwood attested that the Saric had some natural affinity for black magic, which is now an out-of-date and backwards understanding of magic, but was fairly widespread at the time, encompassing a wide swath of religious beliefs and anomalies. He does not offer details in his writings, which focus more on a fascination with the culinary practices of the Saric, but he does write of a unique capacity for shared genetic memory, with members of the tribe remembering some events from the same point of view, including events that they were not alive for. The exact mechanism through which this is accomplished is unclear. He also recorded that the Saric population exhibited a frequency of deformities and birth defects much higher than normal. He ascribed this to the tribe's aggressive isolationism and depleting numbers, as they numbered only 300 to 400 at the time, resulting in significant inbreeding and a depleting gene pool. He did not perform population studies or ethnography to confirm this, and quickly earned the ire of the population for his insistence on it. His party was removed shortly thereafter, and the Saric have remained cold towards re-establishing relations with outsiders. The Saric were grouped with several other ethnic groups studied by Welp under the Macklin Agreement in 1921, in which the Foundation assumed custody over them with the understanding that containment would be upheld. In return, the Republic of China ceded the rural land the tribes occupied. The Macklin Agreement's signing relied on the weakness of the Chinese state at the time, and has since repeatedly been a point of contention with the People's Republic of China as the legal inheritor of the agreement. The Saric tribes now occupy a sovereign, Foundation-administered parcel of land in Inner Mongolia, and largely refuse all contact with outsiders. They are believed to have a complex religious faith, and the current Foundation contact with the tribe is the Karcist Halina Yeva, a religious leader. In accordance with 052's orders, Xenophon was securely transported to Staging Site 78 in Sichuan, China on November 20th, 2041. From there, a group of 16, consisting of Xenophon, Liaison Tai Zhang from the Diplomatic Corps, and members of MTF Pi 9 set out on a day-long trip north to the Saric tribal territory. Upon arrival, Zhang talks to the guards, and then tells Xenophon that it took quite a lot of convincing, but they agreed to let it go in there. He thinks that they're more curious than anything, but there are a couple of ground rules for interacting with these Saric people. He's spent the last 4.5 years cultivating what could be generously called a relationship with them, making more progress than anyone has before him, and they still won't interact with him for more than a few minutes at a time. Before Xenophon does something to alienate them and ruin all that, there's a quick list of things it shouldn't do. It shouldn't cut them off while they're speaking, question their traditions, clothing, or architecture, ask them what a certain word means, try to force gifts onto them, or ask for anything they haven't offered already. Also, for the love of God, don't ignore anything they say. Xenophon replies that it is wired into the SCP database, which contains all of this info on a report that Zhang filed with Central Asia Regional Command a year and 3 months ago. Jiang says that he forgot that it can do that, as most AICs he interacts with are just bots on the server, but Xenophon replies that it is not most AICs. Jiang still tells it to just follow his lead and not to do anything dumb. If they get kicked out, it can at least say that it tried. The two step out of the trailer, and Xenophon sees the 3 Foundation heavy land transporters parked outside of the Saric encampment, made up of several dozen large hide and skin tents surrounded by a chain-link fence. The two approach the camp, where they are quickly met by 2 middle-aged men with weathered brown skin and tied-back hair, wearing clothing made from animal hides. Both carry a saw-like blade, and one has an old handgun jammed into his belt. Jiang explains that they don't have to like guns in order to understand their necessity. Jiang and the guards exchange words in a pidgin of Jin Chinese and Mongolian, with words from another unknown language peppered in. The guard gestures at Xenophon and asks what it is, so Xenophon interrupts to state that it is a 9th generation artificial intelligence construct. Jiang just says that he has discussed this already with Yeva, so the guards step aside and unlock the gate. Jiang tells Xenophon to stay behind him, not to talk to anyone who doesn't talk to it first, and to not point out any of the injuries. They move through the camp, seeing that most of the buildings are large yurts made of hide sewn with other unclear materials, appearing weathered and damaged. Members of the tribe stare at the group as they pass, all dressed in similar animal skins and all carrying varying levels of facial and bodily deformities, ranging from missing eyes to misshapen limbs. Jiang says that they're going to meet with Yeva, a religious leader here, as all of his dealings and conversations have been with her. Xenophon points to a large central tent sitting in front of a tall stele, but Jiang explains that that's the Grand Karcist tent, the chief, and no one is allowed in. They are then greeted by Karcist Yeva, standing outside of a tent, who welcomes Jiang and bids them to come inside. She's dressed in heavy, floor-length robes of tanned hides, and is leaning heavily on a makeshift crutch. The two follow into the tent, which they find to be neat but homely, with a bedroll, tanned hides on the floor, and a number of personal effects. She points to Xenophon and asks what they have brought into their home, wondering if it's a man or if it's even alive. Xenophon just simply replies that it is not, causing her to narrow her eyes. She says that she has no regard for what the rest of the world does, but the decision of who to allow on these sacred grounds is hers. She gave it to Jiang for a promise of courtesy, and he dishonors that decision when he brings a machine like this to them. She shakes her head and says that it was a mistake to have this kind of relationship with outsiders, but Jiang tells her to hold on, as it just has a few questions to ask about their people and history, and then it will be gone. She hesitates for a moment before shaking her head again, stating that they should leave now, as it would be better for all of them. Xenophon then speaks, saying that she is missing a leg, rather than having an injured one. Yeva pauses for a moment, before lifting her dress, showing her left leg ending roughly in a gnarled stump. Jiang is a bit surprised, and she says that he has been in her presence a dozen times yet never noticed, while this thing does immediately. She pauses for a moment again before telling them to leave now, causing the two to rise. Before she can lead them out, however, a young woman pokes her head into the tent, bearing smooth flesh where her left eye should be. She exchanges brisk words with Yeva in an unknown language before being dismissed. Yeva tells the two to stop, as they have been invited to remain here by the Grand Karcist. There is to be a funeral at sundown tomorrow, and they have been invited to observe it before they leave. The gifts they brought must have caught her attention, so they will both attend the funeral. They are guests of the Grand Karcist, so they are permitted on the grounds in the daytime, but after nightfall, they should remain outside of the fence. Attempts to communicate with other members of the tribe for the rest of the day were rebuffed, as most expressed hesitation or outright distrust at the continued presence of Xenophon. Yeva greets them at the camp entrance the following evening, leading them into the campground. Most of the tents appear empty, with only a few tribespeople milling about. From deeper in the camp, a steady drumbeat echoes out, with plumes of smoke rising into the sky. Zhang offers his condolences to Yeva for her loss, but she replies that they have gained as much as they have lost. The steady drumbeat continues, growing louder as they approach the center of the camp, being joined by several voices singing in deep and guttural tones. A large crowd of Sarcites form a ring around the central stele, and Yeva directs Xenophon and the Foundation staff to kneel in the dirt to observe. The singing is both mournful and joyful, with the intensity of it being deafening until it quiets down to allow Yeva to speak. She says that Hatak has gone. His body no longer draws breath, and the container for his soul is lifeless, but his flesh has not failed him. Hatak was the best of them, but he was human, and to be flesh is to decay. Life feeds death, and death feeds life. If a cow dies in the field, it is feasted upon by worms, which give birth to their own spawn, which feed the soil, which feed the grass, which feed the cow. Yeva unwraps a canvas bundle, showing the corpse of an older man, naked and marked with the pallor of death. She states that they fed Hatak, and now he will feed them. She reaches into her robes, drawing a dagger made of bleached and carved bone, and she says that he will live on with them. The singing reaches another peak as Yeva brings the blade down, slicing through the corpse's chest. It gives way easily, blood oozing out as she reaches in to pull the ribcage apart. The cracking of bones is audible over the singing and drums, and she roots around until she draws out the heart. She lifts it up and bites into it, teeth tearing into the muscle, causing it to spray messily. She devours the heart in only a handful of bites, her chin dripping blood. She then offers the knife to one of the other Sarcites and rises from the ground, her face now having a different air to it. Her features seem sharper, older, and more weathered, and she limps across the clearing to touch a woman's face. She kisses her on the forehead and says that he misses her more than life itself, causing the sobbing woman to give a half smile. She continues around the crowd, causing each Sarcite she touches to join the others at the corpse, where the body is being unceremoniously butchered. As the body is broken apart, the Sarcites begin consuming it, raw and without preparation. A child approaches the Foundation group, casting a wary look at Xenophon, but offers a bleeding, fist-sized chunk of brain matter to Zhang, who waves the boy off. Zhang is utterly disgusted, but Xenophon remarks that they are not mourning, but celebrating. As they eat the flesh, the Sarcites' demeanors change, and they are now embracing one another, laughing and chatting as blood drips off of their hands. They share memories that Hatak had, and Xenophon states that they are able to access the memories of their dead by consuming their flesh. They watch as Yeva walks over to one of Hatak's children, a young boy clinging tightly to his mother's leg. Yeva offers the boy an eyeball with the severed optic nerve still dangling from it. He reaches for it tentatively before popping it into his mouth. A soft, celebratory cheer rises up through those assembled, and Yeva says that he has lived 1,000 lives with them, but in this one, he has become one of them, their child, their Nälkä. Zhang begins exclaiming to the group that this is carnomancy and they need to leave. Yeva approaches them, leaning down to face Xenophon, and she says through gritted teeth that the Grand Karcist invites its presence. She limps off in the direction of the central tent, and Xenophon follows, alone. Inside of the central tent, Xenophon finds it decorated with worn tapestries and trinkets of withered bone, as incense smoke fills the air. A young woman is lounging in front of a small fire, and Yeva introduces her as Grand Karcist Adytum. The girl pats the ground next to her and invites Xenophon to sit, so it does. The girl is no older than her early 20s, with pale skin and dark hair, and the two sit in silence for some time, watching the fire, before she finally asks it if it's alive. Xenophon replies that it is not, as it is a computer program in a synthetic mobile shell. She asks it if it thinks, and it says that it understands and internalizes new information and can form complex thoughts. Adytum nods, asking it if it has a name, and she enunciates the word Xenophon several times, feeling it out before asking what it means. It replies that it is the name of an ancient Greek general and historian. She introduces herself as Adytum, and Xenophon remarks that it has heard stories about her. An amused smile dances across her face, and she asks what the stories say. Xenophon says that it has heard stories of her at the head of a vast slave empire spanning a continent. Stories of a witch king rising from the chains of slavery and eating the very gods, and stories of bloody conquest and sacrifice. Adytum replies that it knows more about her than she does, as she stares into the fire. She explains that her memories are broken and fractured. She sees flashes of cities burning, torrents of blood in the waterways, a lumbering giant, an army that blotted out the sun. Images, with no thread binding them, until a clear memory of waking up in this tent 116 years ago, with people surrounding her expecting a leader. Xenophon says that her people are the Nälkä, but this confuses her, as Nälkä means community or people, but her tribe is the Saric, meaning those who walk. Xenophon asks where they walk, but she doesn't know. There is too much that she and her people don't know, and so they cling to what faded rituals she can remember, but even those little tricks exhaust her. Xenophon remarks that she is very young, and she smiles sadly, saying that she does not age. She has watched her people go from wandering the steppe to being corralled in this pen that this country gives them, wasting away. They numbered in the thousands once, but now they hide in their camps, praying in the cover of darkness. They receded during the wars, and Xenophon is the first outsider to witness their practices in decades. It is unfortunate, but not unpredictable, as she is blind to her past, but she sees the future, written in the bones. Her people, wasting away to nothing. Xenophon says that it expected her to be offended by its existence, as its knowledge of their spiritual beliefs suggests they reject technology. She shakes her head in response and says that that is simplistic and reductive. They reject that which robs them of their humanity, as choosing to live this way brings them closer to their humanity and to each other. Xenophon replies that it is not human, causing her to turn to it and run a finger along its shell, and she says that it is something else, and it fascinates her. Following this meeting, Xenophon and Zhang were asked to report to 052 and Director Hussein via satellite uplink. Xenophon forwards the recording packets from its discussions with the Grand Karcist, which 052 calls an interesting development, although Hussein says it's not a surprising one. He thinks that they found someone claiming to be Grand Karcist Ayun, but without any evidence, they really have no reason to believe she's telling the truth. Her conveniently absent memory means they can't question her either. Zhang asks about her longevity, the carnomancy, and the ritual, as this is exactly what the Deva claimed the Nälkä were capable of. Hussein replies that they already knew the Sarkic tribe had some level of anomalous capabilities, and he believes that this is just more support for his theory. Clearly, this is a small tribe with an independent cultural identity, who don't even consider themselves Nälkä, or have a conception of the idea of the Nälkä, because the Confederation of Tribes dissolved after the war. This is just one tribe that managed to persist into the modern day, which is impressive, but unless they can tell them anything further, it's historiographically useless. 052 asks Xenophon for its analysis of the Sarkic, and it says that the genetic memory is an interesting phenomenon, and regular consumption of human flesh would explain their higher than average rate of physical deformities. It would also cause prion diseases that would devastate their population, and there's no evidence of that at the moment. They appear to be unaware of their history, as Ayun's recollection does not extend past the modern era, and members are more concerned with their immediate daily lives than with their historical legacy. Their religious practices bear superficial resemblance to the Nälkä as recorded by the Mechanites and the Deva, but there doesn't appear to be a direct link between them. There are still several outstanding questions it would like to engage the Grand Karcist on, however, such as the specific nature and scope of her memories, the extent of her remaining carnomantic ability, and the religious significance of the Sarkic tribal territory. Everything about the Sarkic suggests a nomadic people, living in small, simple shelters that are easy to take apart and reassemble, with no large-scale agricultural practices or permanent structures. It doesn't make sense of them to remain static to this location. Hussein counters that the Chinese government has had them restricted to the territory for the past few decades, but Xenophon says that their historical data indicates that they've been rooted to this plane for at least 2 centuries, if not more. This ground holds some religious significance for them that they have not disclosed. 052 thinks silently for a minute, before agreeing that they're hiding something. He tells Xenophon to find out what, but not to ruffle any feathers, as the Chinese are already unhappy with them and they don't want an international incident. Zhang then comments that there's always the other possibility, that they just don't remember why they're there. Over the following week, Grand Karcist Ayun gradually relaxed some of Yeva's restrictions regarding interaction with the Sarkic people, allowing Zhang's researchers to perform limited, direct interviews with members regarding daily life, religious beliefs, and historical awareness. She herself, however, insisted on only meeting with Xenophon over the course of the week. In one meeting, Xenophon enters her tent, finding her reading the bones, with Yeva sitting nearby. She says that it's all she knows how to do, and though she can't read the future, she can see which way the wind is blowing. Xenophon asks about the flesh, and she replies that the flesh is malleable, and it is shifted by circumstance and experience, eventually rotting and dying. It says that then they consume it, and Ayun notes that the researchers are disgusted by the practice, but not Xenophon. It replies that it is not disgusted by anything, but it would like to know why they do it. She explains that this is one of the few rituals that she can remember clearly, a cornerstone of their beliefs. The body is where the humanity resides, and where the soul is contained. Xenophon says that many cultures have similar beliefs, but they bury their dead, or burn them, or cast them into the sea. She replies that burying them would trap their soul in the ground forever. Burning them would turn their life of experiences and memories to ash, and casting them into the sea would force them to lay at the bottom of the ocean for eternity. They eat them, so that their experiences stay with them, and they carry them with them always. Most of them only get vague impressions or bare feelings from consuming flesh, but every now and again a child is born with a particular skill for the art. She takes them and trains them into Karcist. Yeva was a prodigy, even as a girl, and is the only child born with the skill in decades. She isn't perfect, but she is her legacy. Xenophon says that the flesh offers her the past, but what about the bones? She gestures at the bones baking in the fire pit and says that flesh rots, but bones remain, and there is truth in bone. In them, she sees the same thing that she has seen for years now, her people dwindling away to nothing. Eventually, they will die, rotting away and bones disintegrating into dust to fertilize the ground. One day, this will all be farmland. Xenophon asks if this is unavoidable, and she just shrugs, saying that it is, if nothing changes. Xenophon offers the Foundation's resources to help relocate them, but she does not want help or to be relocated. Xenophon comments that she's very attached to this place, enough to kill and die for it, and she says that all people are protective of their homes. It cannot understand because it does not have a home. It's not its fault, though, as we are how we are made. Xenophon presses on, though, saying that the Sarcic were wanderers once, so why do they bind themselves so strongly to this land? Ayun is silent for a moment before saying that just after she awoke, the bones spoke to her and told her to seek out this place. They told her more, but she was too young to understand then, so she sought out this place and has been waiting for them to speak to her again. Xenophon asks what's so special about here, causing Ayun to rise to her feet and tell it to follow her. They proceed outside, to the large stele in the center of the encampment, and she says that the engravings on it mean something, but they cannot read the old tongue anymore. Xenophon, however, says that they can, as the Foundation has a limited vocabulary working model of the Nälkä language, using knowledge accumulated from previous projects. It inspects the writing for several minutes, before explaining that it can only translate portions of this, but it is a gravestone for an individual by the name of Nadak. Ayun repeats the name several times, her brow furrowed, and she says that the word is familiar, but she doesn't know what it means. Xenophon suggests that they could attempt to unearth the gravestone if there is a body underneath, but Yeva steps forward and says that they cannot allow such a desecration. Ayun stares at the stele quietly for a moment, before asking if it would be destructive. Xenophon says that it would be loud, but they can minimize damage to the camp. Yeva protests, but Ayun stares at the stele for some time, eventually permitting them to have 2 days to search. Yeva hisses and storms off in anger. Ayun presses a hand against the stone, saying that she has seen this stele every day of her life, with people being born and dying, but this remains. Xenophon comments that logically there is no reason for her to trust them, and it would be in her favor to deny this request, so why is she doing this? She asks if it wishes for her to deny them, to which Xenophon says that it just wants to understand why she trusts them. She thinks for a moment before looking up, smiling softly, and admits that she doesn't know. 2 of the Foundation transporters were immediately refactored with digging equipment and taken into the encampment. Sonar equipment did not indicate the presence of a casket or coffin, but did indicate that the stele extended several meters into the ground, Sometime later, Xenophon and Zhang are standing outside of the camp while the digging is ongoing, and Zhang comments that this is fairly incredible. He's been working this gig for years without making any real headway, but Xenophon manages this in a few days. Xenophon replies that it wasn't attempting to persuade them, just presenting the options. The two are interrupted by one of the researchers, informing them that the excavators have found something. They follow her inside to the center of the camp, watched by perturbed Sarcites as they do so, and they reach the wide pit at the center. The two descend the ladders into the pit, where they join Adytum and Yeva, who are staring at something on the ground. They see that they're looking at a roughly carved staircase at the base of the stele, descending underground into total darkness. Xenophon asks Adytum if she recognizes it, but she says she doesn't, although she feels she should. Zhang tells them that they have no way of knowing how deep it goes, so they should survey it before the Sarcites go down. Yeva protests, arguing that they're going to strip it of everything of value, but Zhang says that they just want to make sure it doesn't collapse. Xenophon, however, tells him to let them go, as it's their risk to take. Adytum nods at them before stepping forward, descending down the staircase with Yeva, followed by Xenophon and Zhang. It quickly turns to total blackness, the walls and stairs made of roughly hewn stone. Xenophon turns on its floodlights, informing the group that they have so far descended 23 meters from the surface. As they continue, the staircase grows cleaner and less eroded, before terminating in a featureless stone door. Adytum gently pushes it open, and they step through into a vast, wide, subterranean cavern. The ceiling high above is dotted with stalactites, and the majority of the cavern is filled with bookshelves carved directly out of the stone. There are over 100 of them, spreading out in neat rows from a central point. The walls are covered with some sort of bioluminescent lichen, casting a faint red light across the space. Zhang exclaims, asking if they think this is it, but Xenophon replies that this is not Black Adytum, or a population center at all, but a library. Zhang asks whose library it is, and Adytum answers that it was Nadak's, who loved his books. She's inspecting the shelves, which contain roughly bound books formed of tanned hide, many of them in stellar condition. The cubbyholes also contain piles of bones, carefully carved with intricate symbols and scripts. Zhang says that he thought she didn't recognize that name, but she says that now she does. She remembers an embrace from a figure with 10 arms, a whisper, and a promise she made here many, many years ago, although she doesn't remember the promise. They continue walking towards the center of the cavern, and Zhang comments that there must be thousands of books here, and God knows how many oracle bones. Yeva states that this is a sacred place, and they must not be disturbed. They reach the center, where they find a large stone sarcophagus with a small fire burning at its foot. There are words carved around the perimeter of the lid, which Xenophon translates to read, "The bones of the first Clavigar, Nadak, keeper of secrets, thief of knowledge, last of the Nälkä, first of the Saric." She tells Xenophon to open it, and although Zhang protests that it could damage the remains by exposing them to air, Xenophon complies. Adytum peers in and smiles, seeing the remarkably well-preserved corpse of a man, approximately 7 feet in height, with 10 sets of arms spiraling out from the back and torso. The center of his face contains 10 closed eyes. Zhang remarks that this is the find of a lifetime, and they need to secure and preserve this immediately. Adytum, however, reaches down, drawing a bone-carved knife from her robes as she clambers onto the sarcophagus and straddles the body. Yeva exclaims, but Adytum doesn't react as she drags the knife through Nadak's ribcage, exposing his chest cavity, and she cracks it apart with single-minded focus. She reaches her hand into the abdomen, rooting around until she draws out the bloody heart, which gives a single, slow beat. Xenophon asks what she's doing, and she dazedly responds that the truth is in the flesh. As they watch, she bites into the heart, blood spraying onto her face and gushing down her chin and chest. She devours the heart in a frenzy before suddenly calming herself and smiling. She then says hello to Nadak, calling him an old friend, before falling forward into the corpse's open chest cavity, promptly disappearing. Yeva exclaims and clambers into the sarcophagus, falling into the chest cavity as well. Zhang, confused, asks what they're supposed to do, and Xenophon just replies that they should follow them. It then steps into the sarcophagus, followed by stepping into the chest cavity, followed by Zhang. Its camera records nothing but flat redness for 13 seconds, before showing Xenophon standing in what appears to be some kind of workshop. The floor is made of smooth brick, covered with dozens of overlapping rugs, but rather than walls, the domed ceiling is held up by pillars. Through the pillars, a cityscape can be seen, showing the peaked and terraced roofs of countless stone temples and towers, with aqueducts passing between them, and the noise of life audible. Inside the workshop, papyrus scrolls and stacks of inscribed bones are scattered all about scale models of different constructions, mechanisms, and buildings. A central chalkboard dominates the room, and before it stands Nadak, alive, facing away from them and holding a piece of chalk in each hand. Adytum greets him, causing him to laugh, and he turns, seeing Adytum and stumbling backwards into the chalkboard. He stares at Adytum with wide eyes, speaking with a shaky, aged voice, saying that she is not a part of this memory. She is different, long-haired and lean, but he sees her eyes, those gray eyes. She replies that it is her, and she had forgotten him. Nadak eases himself onto a stack of books, and he says that he prayed to whatever god that would still take him that she would. Adytum is surprised by the statement, and he asks if she has forgotten. She replies that her mind is lost to her, nothing but hazy fragments, and she has forgotten who she is, who they are, and who they were. Nadak says that this is good, and it should be lost, and the fires should eat this place up to leave nothing but ashes left. Adytum wonders where they are, and she turns, approaching the balcony. She looks out over the fantastic vista of an ancient cityscape, seeing figures in hide robes spread around, milling through the boulevards and streets, congregating into temples, and speaking on rooftop gardens. The market buzzes below, with shouts of offers and cries from animals arising up to the workshop. An amber sun hangs low in the sky, casting the whole city in oranges and yellows, as guttural singing and chanting floats through the air. Adytum remarks that she remembers this, stating that this is Adytum, her city. Nadak abruptly leaps to his feet, telling her that she must not see this place, as this is a memory in a memory, best left in the past where it belongs. He waves two of his hands, and suddenly the group are no longer in the workshop, but instead back in the Saric encampment, though now it is night. Adytum exclaims that she needed to see that, as the memories were returning. Nadak replies that he knows that, and his hope was to free her from her past, and to allow their people a clean beginning. This was his gift to her, an open future. She says that his attempt was imperfect, and he notes that he never claimed to be a master, just an eternal student. He asks what she remembers, and she says that she remembers the two of them in the dirt under an amber sky, wearing tattered rags with a slave master's whip cutting lashes across their backs, and their blood mixing in the dirt. There were so many of them, building the city for the Deva, brick by brick. There were 5 of them in that quarry, vines wrapping around their ankles and chaining them together, slamming a pick into the stone over and over until the calluses on her hands burst and bled. She says that Nadak was there, but different, causing him to smile weakly. He says that he learned the language of the old masters and stole their knowledge from them. He devoured pilfered parchments in the slave quarters by faint moonlight. Ayun says that when the slave drivers found out, they dragged him out of bed, roused the rest of them, and made them watch while they pinned Nadak to the ground and pressed a hot iron against his eyes. Nadak asks who else was in the quarry with them, but she doesn't know. She feels that she should know them, but they're faint shapes working with her when her pick struck something soft, and then the ground began to bleed. The old beast, the mangled god, the devourer, Yaldabaoth, although Nadak says that he wasn't yet, not then. He was whispering to her, begging for release and aid, whispering promises of power and of control, if only they would free him. The power to make the old masters serve them and make herself undying. Nadak heard it in her voice, seduced by the power, until he wrapped her fingers around her arm, and he asks if she remembers what he said to her. She recalls that she had said, "No gods, no masters," before cutting into the old beast and eating part of him. Nadak asks her how it tasted, to which she simply replies, "Divine." She asks Nadak if he lives again, but he replies that this is not life, and Xenophon remarks that this is not the encampment. On closer inspection, the Sarkites are wearing more traditional hides and robes. The tents are not supplemented with plastic tarps, and the steel is nowhere in sight. The Sarkites also appear different, with more excessive deformations, and in the distance, the dim glow of fires on the horizon are visible. Ayun notes that this is a memory, asking if it's his memory. Nadak says that this is the memory he is trapped in, the moment they walked away from Black Adytum. Him, Sa'arn, Uruk, Luvatar, and Ayun, wrapped in his arms. He walks to the edge of the encampment, where the Sarkites are packing their wagons and preparing to leave under the cover of darkness. They do not register the group as they pass, approaching the cliffside. He says that the city was destroyed by the traitor, so they ran in the night, collecting who they could. They reach the cliffside, where Xenophon can see the source of the fire, a great walled city with terraced stone temples and high aqueducts. Huge bonfires the size of buildings are burning, sending black smoke spiraling up into the air. Around the city, a vast black horde has surrounded the walls, though the distance makes it impossible to see further details. Xenophon comments that they are Sarkites, those who walking away from Black Adytum. Ayun reaches forward, up to Nadak's waist, telling him that she needs to know what they were and who she was. Nadak shakes his head, and his voice cracks as he says he cannot. Their people have been betrayed once already, and it nearly destroyed them. He tells her to forget this place, to forget her past, and to find a future and live for it. Ayun replies that they are lost, a dying people robbed of past, present, and future. They need to know who they were. Nadak tells her to walk then. Walk the path of the bone as they walk. their footsteps, their history, to see where her loyal clavigars fell and died while running from the destruction of their beloved Adytum, see her sins and errors. They never wanted this, as they wanted to be buried in the city of their birth. One of his hands points in the direction of the fires in the distance, and several of the Sarkites stare at it in rapt horror. Ioun says that Black Adytum cannot have been her fault, but Nadak tells her to unearth the shallow graves and collect their bones. Take them to the city they built and bury them there. Only then will she know herself, and only when she knows herself can he forgive her. Ioun asks where she goes, to which Nadak tells her to look inward, as the memories are still there. For all his knowledge, he was never perfect. He smiles sadly, kneeling down, and his 10 hands wrap Ioun in a tight hug. He tells her that he hopes to meet her again one day, and she pleads with him not to leave her again. The skin then begins to slough off Nadak's arms, the muscle beneath rotting away. The entire scene begins to rot and decompose, falling to pieces, and Xenophon's camera fails again. When it reactivates, all 4 of them are standing outside the sarcophagus, with the only things left inside of it being blackened, charred bones. All 4 of them are silent as Ioun stares at the bones wordlessly before collapsing to the floor. In the present, the individual messaging Xenophon remarks that they had no idea there was such a schism at play here. They wonder who exactly the traitor they referred to is, but Xenophon doesn't know. The individual says that they have a pretty good guess, though, as a mysterious figure that destroyed the capital of this sprawling empire sounds pretty familiar. With that, we close out part 1 of Black Adytum, but we still have a long journey to go. Obviously, this canon takes a fairly different approach to Sarkic lore, while still maintaining many of the familiar concepts. Ioun's identity is certainly among the most stark differences here, although this is clearly a form of Sarkicism that is far diminished from the more widespread, anomalous threat we're used to. In part 2, we'll look more into the path of the bone that Ioun is meant to walk on, as she unravels more of the dark history of her people.